Привет. Как дела? Did I do okay? So I'm sorry, that's the only Russian I know aside from vodka. And my jokes don't get any better, so I'm sorry. I'm here to talk about driving cultural change. I'm Jim. My contact information is here. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, email. My slides are on speaker deck. So if you're interested in some things that are in my presentation that are on the slides, you don't have to worry about taking notes. You can just find them here. So if you take one note, this is it. So I also wrote a book called The Leadership Journey, and I don't put this up here trying to sell this book. I put it up here because I think there's some interesting things that tie into the talk about learning how to be a change agent or a cultural influencer. So you can have a look at my book. Again, this URL is up on Speaker Deck, but it's on LeanPub. So let's talk culture for a minute. What do your days at work look like? Are you stuck in a lot of bad meetings? Has anyone been working on a really bad project that is overtime all the time, and it's such a bad project that they even have warning signs about not trying to hide under your desk? Does that sound familiar? Does anyone know who this is? Sisyphus. So Greek mythology, cursed to push a big stone up a hill, and he'd get to the top and the rock would fall back down and he'd have to go back. So do some of you have work days that look like this? And then at the end of the day, sometimes we sort of feel like we can't fix anything and we should just probably burn everything to the ground. Okay, so our workplaces don't have to be like this. And what I'm hoping is that you'll take away some very specific ideas from my talk that I hope can be helpful to you when you get back to your work. And so some of the things that I'll be talking about is what should the good culture look like? What should the future state be? We should be focusing on value. We should be focusing on the business. We should have an idea how to identify and overcome roadblocks. I'm hoping to give you some ideas to help you find advocates, people at your business that can help you drive culture change, drive technical change, whatever you like. We also need to learn about how to manage expectations, and I'll talk some about that as well. So what should the culture in our workplaces be like? And particularly around testing is changing. Thankfully, we're realizing that the practices that we have done for years or decades are not necessarily the best way to help our organizations, to help our customers, to help our users. So as part of that, we testers need to understand a few different things. We need to be champions of the business. So testers were often called the user proxy, the customer proxy. And that's important, but I think that one of the things we need to get better at is understanding the business side of things, because if we can better advocate for the business, we'll also be better champions of our customers, of our users, of all those traditional things that we've always thought of as our role. How many of you are in environments where your testing communication comes at the end of all of the work? Anyone? A few hands? Okay. Well, that's good, because communication should be happening much, much earlier, to the point where I encourage testers to get involved at the very beginning of a project. So even when the business stakeholder has an idea, they talk to sometimes the architect, they'll talk to technical leads. Why can't we as testers be involved in those conversations? Because we may help fundamentally change what the business decides they need to build and how they need to build it. So let's try to make that goal that future culture, one that supports we testers being involved across all phases of communication. And I think that also we need to be far more technical as testers. It's been really impressive to be here at Heisenbug and look at all of the different sessions because they're all very technical. And I want to be clear here, technical is not just coding. All right, so I've been a software developer in the past, I do a lot of test automation, but being technical isn't just writing code. Being technical is having a better understanding of data flows, of understanding your web service architecture, of understanding error handling, exceptions, right? So when I say more technical, I'm talking about getting away from all of those really awful manual test cases that were overly specified and being smarter about how the system works. And I think one of the important things as we move to more modern testing is to spread testing competency, the testing skills, across the entire team. We testers shouldn't just hold on to that testing expertise, to that testing skill. We should try to infect the rest of the team, the rest of the organization with test skills, with testing ideas. And sometimes this means that I work myself out of a job. If I can get a team of developers and business analysts and program managers, project managers, to the point where they are shipping defect-free software that works well, that brings value to the business, do I really need to be on that team as a tester? I may not need to be. And working myself out of a job on this team is okay. And I think we should embrace that because this is part of us helping the entire business, the entire organization get better. We have to push for continual improvement. And part of that is learning lean thinking. So lean software development, lean manufacturing, if you understand some of the concepts around that, that's very valuable stuff that we can bring into our organizations that we're trying to change. And then there's the theory of constraints. And I want to talk about that for a moment because not everyone's familiar with theory of constraints. But theory of constraints is the idea of bottlenecks. So I find something in our software delivery process that is slowing us down. And it's the worst thing that's causing us the most difficulty. Maybe we don't have a build server. Maybe we're not using even a simple Jenkins server for continuous integration. I don't mean continuous delivery. I just mean changes are made to the software. Let's get a build server to pull all the changes, build it. Maybe we run some tests if we have them. But if I can find the one big thing that's slowing the team down, that bottleneck, and if I can work on that bottleneck, I find the bottleneck, I fix it, and then I move on to the next bottleneck, and I work on that one. And the idea is that over time, by continuing to focus on these constraints or these bottlenecks, you bring extraordinary improvement to your software delivery effort. And the bottlenecks don't have to be technical, right? They don't have to be a Jenkins server or Azure build or whatever you're doing. They could be other process things. But I encourage you to look into theory of constraints or bottlenecks because as you repeat this process, as you continue to identify and resolve constraints or bottlenecks, you take out all of those really painful, frustrating things that make your workplace sometimes an unhappy place. So how do we get to that point? How do we actually get to where we can make a difference? Because I think too often, testers feel that they're powerless. A lot of times we testers are brought in at the end of projects. We're not listened to. We don't have influence, and we don't have anybody who's an ally or someone that'll stand up for us, someone that will advocate for our ideas and our value that we testers bring. And a lot of times, people don't even know where to start. So I'm hoping this talk will help with some of those points that I just brought up. But I'd like to start by illustrating how change can happen in even very large organizations. So about 4 years ago, the current company that I work for a consulting company, asked me to go in and start working at a Fortune 10 company. So this is a very large company in Michigan. It's a 110-year-old auto manufacturing company. And so do you understand non-disclosure, where I can't say details about my company and my client that I work for? So I can't say the name of this company, but they were in Dearborn, Michigan, and they make a muscle car, sports car, that's named after a horse. But I can't tell you what the name, okay? So the company has 200,000 employees, and they're on every continent. Nobody's on Antarctica. I told you my jokes don't get better. All right, I also want to be very clear that my role in change at this organization, I was a consultant, 200,000 people across the globe. Here's a pie chart showing my effective change. Oh, wait. So there's a tiny little piece here. So this is making a little joke here, but I'm trying to emphasize that I didn't drive the change. I was part of it. But I think there's still good lessons to learn. When I was brought in, I was hired to just help write WebDriver. So I've been a test automation guy for 10 or 15 years. I've got a lot of experience with WebDriver and other UI. If you've worked around other groups of people, it's never just about WebDriver. There were many other problems, but this gave me the opportunity to come in and start working with the team. So this organization, when you're that large of an organization and you're that old, it may not surprise you that there are bureaucracy problems. So it took me 5 days to get my laptop so that I could actually start working. So literally, they were paying me for 5 days, and I couldn't write any software. I paired up with other people, but it was 5 days before I got my laptop, and other people on the team were shocked. And they weren't shocked that it took 5 days. They were shocked it took only 5 days. So bureaucracy, not very healthy, bad culture. There are people problems. In an organization that old and that hasn't changed much, you get people who have built their own power structure. Maybe they're fearful of change, maybe they're resistant, so they tend to build castles, right? Here's my castle, and this is my area, and it's a great, beautiful castle because it's very powerful, and I built this castle. And they think of the castle like that when in reality it's something much less important or magnificent, but still it's a people problem because in their head they see their power. So there were lots of culture problems as well. In many organizations, people are afraid of change. They're resistant to change. They don't understand the reason why. They don't understand the change that you're trying to make. They don't understand the benefits of it. And you may or may not have seen this, but there's always the thing of we're too busy to stop and try to change or improve. So this project that I was brought on, the first version had a team of over 200 people, and I think it was actually closer to 250. And they worked for 3 years. They had one release. One release in 3 years. Now, it was a complex business system, and they were dealing with external integrations and everything, but still, one release in 3 years. And it may not surprise you that they had over 250 bugs when they released. Oh, and those were bugs in production. 3 years, one release, 250 bugs. Worse, the testers didn't know a single user of the system. So as testers, how are we supposed to advocate to understand, are we building the right thing if we don't actually know anyone that's using it? And the testers were generally on different continents as well. And I don't have problems with remote teams. I have problems when remote teams are ineffective and don't communicate. The worst thing was the testers had horrible skills. They flat didn't understand data flow. They didn't understand where data on the screen was coming from. I literally had one person tell me that the data was built on the web page without understanding that there was a very complex data layer that built in a lot of business logic and data pools. And no, it's just built there right on the page. The testers didn't understand things like boundary testing or writing good test data. So does any of this maybe sound a little familiar? So I hear some very painful laughing. This is not uncommon. It's part of how the industry is not just testing, but software development as a whole. And this also is not limited to just gigantic companies. We find this in small companies as well. So think back to what I started to talk off with, right? What should we be doing to try to get better at this? We want constant communication early. So we want to try to get involved early with the business stakeholders and not just requirement specification. I'm talking even before that. If business has an idea about 3 different things that they might want to build, it'd be really great to be in a conversation when they're deciding which of those things to build. So here's a scenario that is actually drawn from sort of real life. We had 3 options of things to build, and the business stakeholder was focused on trying to get one particular system modified a little bit with some functionality to display some new data, and they wanted to push it onto a web page and then also have it on a mobile device. So that's not uncommon, right? Pull some data, massage it, manipulate it, display it on a web page, display it on mobile. But the thing was, there were some problems, and they thought it would take 1 month to be able to put out this relatively small piece. But the conversation went along these lines. Well, do you understand that the data that you're trying to pull is not consistent? So we have data consistency problems, right? There's errors in the data. It's inaccurate. Sometimes it's assembled incorrectly, and we don't know how to fix that. So let's just say that's going to take 2 weeks as a rough guess to fix that. Also, you're asking us to do mobile work, but nobody here has done mobile work, so we have to learn how to work with mobile applications. We have to learn how to make reactive applications that will play well or display well on Android, on iPhone. And oh, by the way, you want to do this in India, where the preference is Android. And how many different versions of Android phones are there? 4,962? I don't know. A huge amount. The point being, there was a huge test matrix now to make sure that the page properly rendered on all of these different devices and different versions. And the conversation got to the point where it was, you thought it was going to take 1 month. We think it's actually going to take 4 to 6 months because of a number of other problems. And the business owner, the stakeholder at that point said, okay, I think this is important, but if it's going to take 4 months, I'd rather work on these other 2 things that we can do in that same amount of time that you're comfortable with. So just think about that. We had the business owner, through a conversation as testers, before a single line of code was written, before a single specification was written, and the business owner changed from doing thing A to instead doing B and C, which the entire team was much more confident about the estimates, and the business owner, in one way, got 2 things when he could have gotten 1. Does that make sense? That's a powerful conversation to be involved in when you can make those kinds of impacts early before any real work is done. Part of this that we need to work on is also understanding knowing the business. And I don't just mean by having a good relationship with your manager, but rather understanding the business's purpose. Why does the business exist? Are you building cars? Are you a financial company who is entrusted with banking online and holding people's money secure? Do you understand how that happens? Are you a business that's basically B2B, providing services to other businesses? How does your company make money? How does your department make money? What's the revenue model? Do you understand how your team's work can influence that? And a lot of times, historically, in IT, we haven't focused on that. We like to hide in our little quiet rooms, and we joke about not liking to talk to people, and we like to joke about the suits, the man. Just put us in a dark room and put pizza under the door, and we'll give you stuff in like 6 months. We can do better. By knowing the business, we become more effective at what we do. Then also, there's the important thing about leveling up our testing skills. I talked about becoming more technical, understanding how data flows, understanding how error handling happens, understanding how your system may fit in microservices or in a service-oriented architecture and messaging bus and blah, blah, blah. The point being, understanding the deeper testing that we can do versus shallow, and focusing on constant improvement of our own skills, constant improvement by working on constraints and bottlenecks, but improving all the time. So that's all really nice. How do we get there from here? And sometimes trying to make change can be very frustrating. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the man from La Mancha, Don Quixote, tilting at windmills. So this it's classic Spanish novel, plays, musicals, but it was the story's around a frustrating or seemingly pointless battle. And sometimes trying to make change can feel that way. But just like Archimedes, if we find the right lever and the right place to put that lever, we can move the world. So first off, choose your battles. You can't fix everything. So I tend to get easily frustrated at the state of the world, and I don't like A, and B makes me angry, and C just makes me want to cry, but I can't fix all three of those. So I have to choose one thing to understand, one thing to try to fix. I talked about the theory of constraints. The idea of bottlenecks can be an extraordinary help to you when you're trying to understand, where can I start? And if you look at it from the point of view of what's the one most valuable thing I can do? What's the biggest bottleneck? What's the most impactful thing you can do? And again, you can't fix everything, but maybe it's one small thing. Can I get testers as part of the delivery team? How many of you as testers are in a separate organization or a separate team from the developers? I'm seeing some hands going up. So it's common that testers are not part of the team, that they're often a different group. That slows down communication. It hurts our ability to understand things. Maybe you can work about getting time on the schedule for skills improvement. Now, you've probably heard of like Google, where they at one point had 20% of everyone's schedule was just available for free learning. That's hard to do, particularly if you work for a consulting company, because this impacts revenue, it impacts billing rates. But the point is, maybe you can work with your organization such that you have 1 or 2 hours every Friday to do a team learning activity. Find something that you can try to make a change on around skills improvement. Maybe It's trying to bring in some DevOps capabilities into your team. So at this particular large company, large auto manufacturer that I worked at, we actually had zero access to any of the servers in any environment beyond the developer's system. So the minute we tried to push to the most rudimentary, lowest environment, we had to file support tickets to get logs off of the system. So when you're trying to troubleshoot or test and understand why something was broken, we would literally have to file a ticket and then wait 5 days to get logs back. And I'm not talking at production level, I'm not talking at staging or UAT, I'm talking at developer level. So it works on my machine, I want to go integrate and put on the next environment. It doesn't work, oh, support ticket, 5 days. Is that productive? Is it helpful? It's awful. But maybe you can work on getting at least administrative permission at the lowest level. And that's a huge bottleneck to take over. Something else that we need to learn how to do is recognizing roadblocks. So, I talked about constraints, but there's also other kind of more cultural things. Systemic inertia. The people who have built those castles, then they think they're grand castles and they don't want to change, that maybe there are policies around your ability to adopt and use modern technology. At the same organization, I fought for a year to get approval to use one small tool that took Gherkin files, given when then files for Cucumber. This one tool would look at all of those text files and build up this beautiful website that would let you search all of your specifications. And it would even integrate over to tell you test coverage results. So I could go to a website and I could read my specifications like a documentation, like a user manual, because we'd organize things that way, and I could see test status on all of that. It took me a year to get official approval for that one tool. Systemic inertia, a huge bottleneck. This ties into organizational policies as well. What policies do you have that are hindering you? No access, no admin rights, long approval for good tooling. How do you deal with those? And then the bad castles. At the end of the day, almost all of this ties back to people and fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And you may have heard that called FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt. A lot of times, that resistance is because someone is afraid of change. You're threatening their perception of their power, and part of this is learning how to convince those people that you're not trying to get them fired. You're not trying to eliminate their job. Instead, you're asking for their help to help you do things more quickly. Skills, another huge roadblock. And sometimes people are not willing to work on their own skills improvement. In that organization, the team of testers that I worked with was about 15 people, and we had about 8 in Chennai, India, and we had 7 or 8, which would make 16, but we had 7 or 8 in Dearborn that I was working with face-to-face. And over the space of 2 years, gradually, through a lot of effort and a lot of frustration, 6 of those people, we brought their skills up, and they understood better technical actions. They knew more about SQL. They knew more about data flows, and they were able to help write test automation. But remember, I said technical is not just coding, right? But the point being, 6 out of those 8 were willing to come along for the journey. 2 just refused. They didn't want to change. And after a year and a half of fighting with them, we just moved them off to some other team. But you have to address those poor skills, and you have to find out how to do that. And I've got some books that I recommend at the end of the talk, and I've got the titles and pictures of the book covers. And they have some specific ways of dealing with that sort of resistance. That's like 3 or 4 conference talks all on its own, but I'd encourage you to maybe look at those books as ways to help try to overcome some of those people-based fear resistance things. Okay, so we've talked about what the future should look like. We've talked about finding roadblocks. We've talked about theory of constraints. How can we start to overcome some of this? I think one of the most powerful things is finding an advocate. So this is where we start to find that lever from Archimedes that we can use to move the world. Because again, as testers, generally, we don't have the power to change budget. We don't have the power to change policies. So how can we find someone that can help us with that? Part of this is learning the business. And again, I bring this up because too often, not just as testers, but IT in general, we don't understand the business side of things. We don't understand the mission. We don't understand how revenue's doing. We don't understand how we impact new customer sales. We don't understand how we can impact license renewals. Whatever your line of business is, spend some time to better understand that. So I mentioned that several times, that oftentimes we as testers don't have a lot of power. So we have to find people that do have power, because that support from that higher level is critical. One way to gather that high-level support is to look for existing initiatives. So the fact of life in organizations is if something is going to happen, it needs time, it needs approval, and it needs money. So we as testers generally don't set budget for anything, right? If you do control budget, good for you. You're probably one of the 1 or 2 people in the room that actually does do that. But if I can find an existing, so with that, it's hard for me to get something new started. So what do I mean by that? Let's take, for example, skills development. All right. I may have a hard time getting time on the schedule to do an hour or 2 of training every week. But that's critical to get that commitment for the team to have time on the schedule and not just say, you need to go learn this at home, but instead say, we're going to take an hour, we're going to take 2 hours every week for the next couple months, and we're going to work on this. If I can say, find an initiative that's already in place that overlaps with training, maybe I can work with that initiative. Somebody already has budget. Somebody already has approval. They are publicizing it. They're socializing it at work. And if I can somehow take part in that initiative and use that to help what I want to get done, then I don't have to spend time trying to get budget. I don't have to spend time trying to get approval or any of that. It's already done. But if I can just attach and go along with that, that's a big help sometimes. And maybe it's infrastructure initiatives. Maybe it is trying to adopt test-driven development. I mean, take whatever the initiative is, right? Look for things that are similar that you might be able to take part of. I think an important thing here as well is finding change agents. So change agents are those people outside of your team, elsewhere in your organization, that are excited about something. In my case, let me go back to, again, the story about my team. I was trying to get better test automation practices in place. And by that I mean having people write better WebDriver code, having people understand what tests to automate, what tests to not automate, and then how to work with developers to change the system to make it more observable and more testable. And the people who were right in front of me, the immediate members of my team, were struggling already to get their work done and learn other things that I was trying to get them to do at the same time. So they were overwhelmed, and they weren't interested or passionate about software craftsmanship, about learning how to write better tests. But I found 2 or 3 other people outside of my team who were very interested. And so every time that I did some kind of training with my team, every time that I sent out examples of how to do work better, every time that I sent out links to things to read, I included those couple people outside because they were really interested. And they were so interested that they kind of took in all of these tips, they took in all of these ideas, they adopted it, and they started telling their friends and their coworkers. So not only was I slowly changing the testers right in front of me, by finding good change agents, I was able to have impact far outside the team. If you can find those excited people, it helps your spirit, it helps your morale. You're not always frustrated. You feel like you have a friend, you have an ally, somebody who's excited about the same things you are, and they can help you by going off and spreading the word themselves, so you don't have to do 100% of the work. Reasonable expectations. I talked about being frustrated by a lot of things and sometimes having a hard time trying to focus down on specifics. But you have to set reasonable expectations for what you can get done when you're trying to change culture. So, especially in large organizations, sometimes the pace of change, how fast change happens, is very, very slow. I talked about it taking me 1 year to get approval for one silly tool. Very slow. But if you can set your expectations, and sometimes they have to be very, very low, then at least it's a reasonable expectation. And the same with the scope of change. We pushed hard for test-driven development. We pushed hard for lean software. We pushed hard for continuous delivery, not just continuous integration, but continuous delivery. And it was unreasonable for us to expect that all of that was going to happen. So on the software engineer side, on the developer side, we just focused down to test-driven development and learning a bit about software craftsmanship, because we couldn't get everything else done. Learn from your mistakes, learn from your losses. Right? Failure is a fact of life, especially when you're trying to convince people, when you're trying to get humans to change, when you're trying to get organizations to change. But there's always something to learn. So again, at this company, it was very interesting. Their technology, as you've probably understood from my complaining, was very old. Their mindset and their culture was outdated in the 1980s. I was trying to prototype an infrastructure change so that I could run Selenium Grid, so I could run my WebDriver tests in parallel and bring down the test time. But I had a problem because I couldn't get permission to get additional machines to run the grid agents on. So if you don't know Selenium Grid, you just make kind of a mesh of machines, and they might be virtual, they might be old desktop machines that aren't used, whatever. You have an agent on each one of them, and then you have something that sends one test over here, one test there, right? So it lets you parallelize, split out your tests. And I kept putting up proposals of, I'd like to spike or prototype this to see if it'll work and get an idea of what's involved in this infrastructure. And it got shot down, it got disapproved every time. And I spent 3 or 4 weeks trying to reword the proposal, and nothing worked. And then somebody told me, and this was extraordinary, it was somebody who was an employee of that company, said, remember, this is a manufacturing company. They're risk averse, and when you say spike or prototype, they think it's scary. They think you don't have anything thought out and that you're going to waste time and it's not going to be a disciplined approach. I said, okay, well, that's stupid. That's not it, but this is my misunderstanding. What can I do better? And the person said, don't call it spike, don't call it prototype, call it an experiment. Spike, prototype, experiment. So the point was, in my head, I was using the wrong term, and when I got my own ego out of the way and I got ungrumpy about the stupidity of this, and I used experiment, and I phrased it like a scientific experiment. I have a hypothesis. Here's my theory. Here's how we're going to test this. Here's how we're going to measure whether or not the experiment was successful or a failure, and here's the things I expect to learn out of it. Okay, all of that is exactly what you do in a spike or a prototype, right? If you're doing it right. Well, the point was, I reframed this as an experiment, and the manager said, yep, go ahead. Whatever. Does anybody have teenage daughters? So I have a teenage daughter, so the expression of whatever, I don't know if that translates here in Russia or not. Okay, you will fail, you will lose, it's okay. Learn from that, adapt, and sometimes that means getting your own ego out of the way and learning to just call a spike an experiment. You also need to celebrate your wins. It can be very hard and very frustrating as you're trying to change the culture. Remember that scenario, version 1. One release in 3 years, more than 250 bugs in production. It was soul-crushing. I wasn't involved in that, and thank God, because I would have drunk myself to death. So in V2, we had an extraordinary change. We made our first push to production in 9 months. Now, to me, shipping once in 9 months is a horrible failure. But that's not the point. They'd shipped once in 3 years, and we shipped our first one in 9 months. And I was like, dear God, we need to have a party. We need to celebrate this win. And the culture didn't appreciate this win. They didn't get it. It was like, yeah, we shipped. Next thing. And it wasn't that they were used to shipping, because obviously they were not. They just didn't think about celebrating wins. And I had a couple mid-level managers and executives who I got along with very well, but they were very frustrated because you may have noticed I'm big and I'm loud and I have some strong opinions. And sometimes I'm not quiet about those. So these managers and executives actually sat in the team room. They had a big open team room that wasn't completely like Amazon open, but there were a few kind of sensible cubicles around for little work groups. And the managers sat at the edge of this. And I don't live in Michigan. I live in Oregon, which is on the West Coast, but I'd fly to the company site every other week, and I'd stay a week or I'd stay 2 weeks. So it was either stay at work and get some things done or go to the hotel, and the hotel's boring. So one night after this first push and after zero support of celebrating, I went and I put this up on the board, the whiteboard, in the team room. And it just happened to be the whiteboard that was directly behind the desks of the managers and the executives. And so I did this late at night after they'd left. And the next morning I got in early, and the managers and the executives walk in and they look at the whiteboard and they look at each other And then the very next thing they did was look out in the team room to find me because they knew who'd put it up there. But the point being, is this not an extraordinary win after shipping once with 250 bugs, once in 3 years, to put something up in 9 months and then notice this, 0 bugs? That's extraordinary. Find your wins and celebrate them. Put it up on the board. Send out emails. Have a party. Because change is hard, and it will grind you down, and it will grind the team down. Celebrate the wins. Okay, so let's talk about what the current state was. And this was kind of current state 2 years ago when I left that project. They were working as a single team, meaning the developers, the testers, the PMs, and the BAs were all together. Nobody was on another continent. We'd split out teams so that we had entire functional teams in India, and we had functional teams in Dearborn. There were 3 Amigo conversations for every work item. And if you're not familiar with 3 Amigos, let me take a minute to discuss this because this is one of the most extraordinary things you can do for change. So the 3 Amigos, tester, business analyst, or PM, and a developer. And you get together for a short discussion on every single work item. It doesn't matter if you're using Scrum or if you're using Safe or using something else, right? It's whatever your work item is, before the developer sits down to write code, you have a 3 Amigos conversation. And you talk about what needs to be tested. You talk about, do we understand what this work item means? Are we clear on what it does? Are we clear on the business value that it brings to the business and to our users? And you talk about who's going to test what and who's going to test what where. What are we automating? What are we exploring? What is the developer going to handle in unit tests? What am I going to handle in API tests? Right? So by having this short discussion, and when you get good at it in a week or two, these discussions take 5 minutes. It's not a requirements meeting. It's a 3 Amigos discussion. 5 minutes of discussion, and everybody's clear and knows what is needed to make this single thing be great. This is one of the most powerful things that I think you can take to an organization, large or small, and you don't need permission to do this. You need some cooperation. Anyway, we went from this team that was didn't talk at all. Literally, testers and developers wouldn't swivel their chairs around to talk to the person behind them in the cubicle. They wouldn't do that. And at this point, they were having 3 Amigos conversations all the time. We had developers and testers pairing on writing code. We had developers and testers pairing on writing tests. And you want to talk about that skills development, that skills improvement, we had people excited about doing that. It's an extraordinary change. The testers became much more technical. So I didn't ever hear again, oh, the data is created on the page, when instead it was actually pulled from web services. I'd ask, where was this data pulled from? And they'd say, oh, well, we had a web service on this system over here, and it spoke to the business logic layer, which went through the object relational mapping system, which went through the, and I'm like, stop, this is really cool. You understand where things are coming from. And remember, technical is not just coding. We had testers that were very familiar with using Postman for REST testing. We had testers that were sitting down and helping write end-unit test cases. We had developers that were helping with SQL optimization. It's extraordinary, and they were excited about it. We also implemented a policy of not filing bugs. 0 bug reports. Why? What value is in a bug database? How many of you are in environments where you have bugs in a database that are open and they've been open for more than 6 months? More than a year? More than 5 years? I'm that guy, by the way. My hand's still up. I've been in those places. What value is there in that? Zero. What value are there in bug triage meetings? So this is an inflammatory, controversial thing, but let me tell you why it works so well and how you do it safely. First off, you have to be really good at testing. That means good automated testing. It means great testers. It means test-minded developers who care. And when somebody finds a bug, you have a quick three amigos discussion. And the discussion goes something like this. Is this related to security, performance, or architecture? No. Can we get this fixed fairly quickly? Can we get this fixed and deployed and tested by the end of the day? And this is pretty amazing. And if the answer to that is yes, fix the bug. What's important? Does our value come from that bug database with bugs that are 5 years old? Or does the value come from working software in production? It's this one over here, working software. This was at Ford, not Ford. That was not the company I was at. This was at the large auto manufacturing company, which had been doing things the same way for many years, and you want to talk about a big fight. But we were very fortunate because, remember, I talked about having advocates. Those mid-level managers who I loved to give a hard time to were actually extraordinary, because when the metrics reporting people would come and say, you haven't filed any bugs, they'd say, no, we fix them, and we have 0 bugs in production, go away. I couldn't do that as a consultant. My testers couldn't do that, but we had advocates who helped us with that. So if you're interested in this immediate fixing 0 bug report thing, please look me up in the hallway. I'd love to chat with you. If you are doing this, I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, find me in the hallway after all of this. But again, what is the value? Is the value all of these things in Jira or SharePoint or some other ungodly, awful tool? Is the value in hours and hours of triage meetings? The value is 0 bugs in prod. The value is great software to your business and to your customer. And oh, by the way, happy testers. And I put this up at a previous conference and said, someone said, testers shouldn't be happy. It's like, why? Why shouldn't we be happy at work? Why shouldn't we feel that we have an influence? Why shouldn't we feel that we have an impact? Why shouldn't we feel that we're doing great work? Okay, so here's some helpful things. I've talked many times about learning the business. All right, I'm not going to talk more about that. Learning more about people. God, people. People are awful. Humans, we suck. Not everybody, just some. But it's hard to learn how to deal with people. You have to learn to get past fear. You have to learn to be able to be okay getting in uncomfortable situations. So I've got some books here, and I apologize they're not in Russian. Maybe there are Russian editions, but if you can work through some of these books, I know they can be very helpful because they've helped me. This book, and remember also, you don't have to take pictures of all of these. It's on speaker deck, or you can take pictures. That's okay. Emotional intelligence is about communication, and it's about learning how you can be a little more open and empathetic and understanding, because good communication is not about you. It's about the other person. We've got a whole nother talk on that. This is an older book, but this is one of the most extraordinary books because there's an entire chapter on personas of people who resist change. This was one of the main books that really got me understanding how much of resistance to change is based on fear. So again, I'd highly recommend this book. Peopleware is another old book, but it's extraordinary, and it talks about the environment in your office, the physical environment, the emotional environment, the cultural environment. It's just a great, great book. In my very first consulting company that I worked for nearly 15 years ago, someone gave me a copy of this book, and the most powerful thing I took out of this book was learning how to say no. How easy is that for you at your work? Oh, hey, we need to have this release ready to go day after tomorrow. No, we can't do it. Is that easy? It isn't easy, but this book helped me to get to understand how to frame those conversations with business people and tell them no with a clear explanation and build trust, because actually, when you're honest and open and you say no, rather than being dishonest and saying yes, and then the thing doesn't work and you don't ship tomorrow, that doesn't build trust at all, right? So this is a great, great book. The Lean Software series by Tom and Mary Poppendike is probably the most influential series of books to me out of anything I've read. And if it's not the most, then it's in one of the top three. And I realize there are three books here, so I don't mean all three books. I mean the books as one. I really can't emphasize enough to have a look at some of these books I list here, because they can be very, very helpful in learning how to influence, how to find out what's impactful. And at the end of the day, also, sometimes just don't ask. Go do wonderful things. Now, some things you have to ask about. If you're dealing with money, ask. Don't say, oh, Jim told me I didn't have to ask. No. But my point being, for so many things, we don't need to go ask permission. We don't need to change a policy. If we are approaching something with good intentions, and we care about the business, and we care about the customers, and we care about our team, then if I install a Jenkins server and forget to let the admins know, but all I'm doing is running unit tests and integration tests on builds, and I can show the value of that, I've done this any number of times in my career, and it's not that I'm trying to be sneaky. Sometimes I just get really tired of fighting the battle, and I want to go do awesome things for my team. So, all right, again, my slides are up on speakerdeck.com/Jim Holmes. My contact information is there. Spasiba.